Hello, 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 and welcome to the Sprinklr Coffee Club. I'm Marshall Kirkpatrick, your host here at the Sprinklr Coffee Club, and we so appreciate your joining us today. I would like to encourage you to pour yourself a cup of coffee or whatever beverage is appropriate in your time zone, whatever the case may be, because we have a very exciting and interesting show ready today with a very special guest, Tom Cheesewright. Tom, thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure, Marshall. Absolute pleasure.
Oh, wonderful. So Tom Cheesewright is an applied futurist. Tom is an author. He's a consultant. He's a podcast producer. He's a man of many talents and a fascinating person online that I have been watching for a couple of years now, and I'm really excited to share a conversation with here with the Sprinklr community and beyond. Tom, can you tell us just a little bit about what you do, what it means to be an applied futurist to start out?
Sure. I mean, my job is really to answer three questions for people. And when I say people, most of my clients are large corporations or bits of government, sometimes charities. And the questions they come to me with are, first of all, what does our future look like? And you know, I'm a nerd. I'm interested in the future, the big future. But really, clients want to know what's going to take me out of the knees in the next 5 years? What are the great opportunities that I'm missing? How do I see these things coming? And so the last few years, I've built up a methodology and a toolkit for how you look at the future, and particularly the near future, actually. I help people really focus on that sort of next 5 years because of this sort of disruptive change we see that I know we're going to talk about. The second question they asked me to help them with is how do we tell that story? You know, once we've got this vision of the future, how do we take it out to our board and go and convince them of the need to invest in change? How do we take it out to our staff and convince them that we need to change and they're going to need to change maybe behavior or skills or the shape of the organization? And actually, how do we take it out to customers? How do we go and tell our customers about the future that we see? Which then leads me to the third question. The most challenging question is, once you've seen this vision of the future and you've convinced your board of the need to invest in change, what on earth do you do? And so I get involved in innovation and particularly organizational design, actually. How do we design organizations and companies that are much more future-proof, that are fit for the future?
Fantastic. What an incredible, I'm sure enjoyable, challenging role to play in a fast-changing world.
Yeah, so, it's incredibly exciting. It's great fun, and I get to learn all the time, which is the best.
Oh, I bet. Speaking of learning, if there are folks out there who are in the live audience who would like to ask a question of Tom today as we proceed with this conversation, please feel free to do so. Jump into the YouTube comment section over on the right, and we will bring your questions into the fold and answer them in due course. I would sure invite you to do that. So Tom, let's start with your recently published book. It's called High Frequency Change. Why it feels like change is happening faster than ever and what to do about it. I got close to that, right?
Absolutely.
Wonderful, wonderful. What? Let's break that up into two questions, perhaps. Well, you might want to start just with the thesis in general, but I am curious how you answer the question. Why does it feel like things are changing faster today than ever before?
So the thesis is important, I think, because when I became a full-time futurist 7 years ago, I started getting these phone calls from these giant corporations asking for help. And one of the first things I wanted to do was understand why are these giant corporations who are, you know, from the outside, we all think know the answers, they're really successful. Why are they calling up and asking for help? And what I realized, there was this sense of fear there, and this sense of fear and sometimes excitement largely came from this sense that change was happening faster now than ever before. And when you start to look around, you see lots of people making this argument. You see, 4-inch thick books from the likes of Ray Kurzweil talking about the singularity. You see all the big consultancies talking to their clients about why they've got to do things differently now because change happens faster. And I was totally sold on this idea. Most people feel it's true. I know this. I surveyed the British population. 70% of adults here in the UK feel like change happens faster now. And so it was a neat story. I was sold on it until I got chatting to a friend who's a historian. who pointed me to the work of other historians who said, I'll say it slightly more politely than I normally do, that it's nonsense. That actually there have always been these periods of accelerated change, of dramatic change, like the Industrial Revolution or the shift from horse and cart to car. And that right now, here in the middle of another revolution, the connected computing revolution, it's very hard for us to say empirically that change is happening faster now than ever before. And what I realized was actually that there's two things going on, is that the grand arc of change, if you like, the pace of change that transforms everything in our lives is probably still moving at the same rate it always has. Human beings haven't changed. We're still sort of ape evolved creatures with a limited set of capabilities to deal with this stuff. We slow things down. It means the grand arc of change is still moving at the same rate it always has been. But overlaid on that, underpinned by the friction removing effects of high technology, there are lots of things that do move faster. And anyway, you're in an industry where the friction has been removed, where there's high speed communications, where the ability to produce new content or products and bring them to market has been, the barriers to doing that have been reduced, then you get these waves of high frequency change. And I point to all sorts of things in the book, whether that's the rate of production of new media, whether that's the rate of turnover of companies, and we've seen a very dramatic increase in the turnover of companies in the S&P 500, for example, or whether that's things like new products coming to market. And I point to the example of the hoverboard in the book, the Swagway, if you like, which certainly here in the UK arrived on the scene, was massively popular within 3 months, and then sales of which collapsed again 3 months later. This sort of 6-month hype cycle has become very characteristic now of these high frequency waves of change. And so while the things that touch most of our lives, the things that change how we live and how we work, are mostly still changing relatively slowly, overlaid on that there's these very, very high frequency waves of change that are constantly disrupting our lives and knocking off balance, and sometimes taking out entire companies. And it's the difference between those two sort of speeds of change that we really have to understand.
That is a remarkable and, to me, novel articulation of the state of things. I wonder if I might ask for you to contrast this theory with one of my other favorite thinkers in the futurist space, Frank Diana, over at TCS, who says that we're in the midst of a period of exponential combinatorial change, where he argues that there are a whole bunch of different things that are changing exponentially, from autonomous vehicles to artificial intelligence to synthetic biology, and they're intersecting and combining to create an even faster accelerated change. But it sounds like you're proposing that we calm down a little bit.
Yeah. I don't think those two ideas are necessarily conflicting. I think you've just got to look at the scope of the change, the scope of the transformation. And one of the things I do is I still really enjoy doing local radio here in the UK. We have lots of local radio stations, and I go on and I get interviewed about all sorts of things, and I get to talk to people. I get to do phone-ins sometimes. And what it always highlights for me, it's like my anchor, it's my grounding back in the real world, outside the world of technology. Because there's all these things on the one hand that I'm hugely excited about. I remain a technologist and a nerd. I'm a mechatronics engineer by training. I love this stuff, and I get swept up in it, and autonomous vehicles and AI and all these possibilities. And then I talked to Doris from North Manchester, on a wet Wednesday afternoon, and it's usually wet here in Manchester. And she doesn't trust the internet and still doesn't have an internet connection at home and won't have a smartphone. And I realized that there's lots of Dorises, and actually most of the world is probably closer to Doris than closer to my house, which is just crammed with technology, and you're ready to leap in and adopt all this stuff. I think we forget how much of a break human society, human culture, human legislation, the need for insurance around all these things, so many things that can put a break on the technological possibility. That while I do think these possibilities are hugely exciting, and as he says, the combinatorial possibilities, now that the barriers to creativity are so much lower than they have been, are really, really exciting. I mean, just yesterday we've had the announcement of 2 different companies launching LiDAR, one of the critical technologies for autonomous vehicles, on a single chip. And then that's just, blown my mind. A complex piece of electromechanical technology shrunk down to a chip. All of a sudden you get these new combinatorial possibilities. But actually Doris and Berry's not going to be adopting that anytime soon. And the number of, Dorises, and they vote, they have a huge influence over politics and legislation. They're going to slow these things down a little bit. So we can get overexcited. We have to contrast the possibilities with the realities, and humanity can be a brake on these things, slowing down how fast they are adopted.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so given that there are these two different paces of change and they have consequences for each other, what should we do either from an organizational perspective or from a personal perspective? Perhaps you can begin from an organizational perspective.
Sure. So my prescription, if you like, is this idea of athletic organizations. And I get out on the speaker circuit quite a lot. I've had the joy of meeting quite a few sort of famous athletes and coaches, and you start to pick up things from them. And they really, I notice in the stories they tell, there's sort of three skills that they all exhibit. And the first one is about their senses. They have this hyper-aware sense of, first of all, what's going on around them, this sort of immediate proprioception, but also this strategic ability to read the game. And to put it in football, in soccer terms, it's that sort of midfielder who can carve out that 40-yard pass and put it right on the boot of the winger who's made the run without even looking up. He knows the winger's made the run. He's read the game. He knows what's happening. They've played together loads of times. He's got that strategic sense just to play that ball forward. And great organizations, future-proof organizations, invest the time in building those senses. They're incredibly close to the customer and the market, and they respond at speed to what the customer and the market is telling them. But they also invest in that foresight, in that strategic sense, that ability to read the game and make those sort of long passes. And very few organizations do that. Once I get under the skin of clients, I find that the processes for looking to the future are quite often broken, or they happen infrequently, or they may be using the wrong processes, or looking at either too far out or not far enough out. And really, it requires a lot more investment in building those senses up, getting close to the customer and looking to the future. And the second thing I find is that a lot of organizations are unlike athletes in their inability to make decisions. See, these great athletes, what they do once they pull that information in, once they've seen that strategic opportunity, they take the decision and they go with it. And organizations, particularly established companies, are really, really slow at taking those decisions. Information moves very slowly through the business. There's a lot of fear at the top. A lot of decisions are still taken based on very little data and a lot of gut instinct. And so I try and teach organizations to do two things. First of all, push as much power as possible to the edge of the organization and get relatively junior people at the edge of the organization taking decisions and moving much more quickly, but also accelerate the flow of information through the business. Do what Howard Dresner, the former Gartner analyst, calls, make a hyper-decisive organization. We can do it now. The tools are relatively cheap. We can pull information in quickly. We can inform our decisions much better. And then the third thing is perhaps the most difficult one to get your head around, but I've seen this fundamental shift in the shape of successful organizations. And just like athletes train themselves to be fit for the sport they're in, I think organizations have to train themselves for a new sport now. They've spent probably the last 50 years training for a world where optimization was king. They were focused on continuous process improvement, doing better tomorrow what they did yesterday. Whereas now adaptability is the absolute king. If you want to build sustainable success, you've got to build an adaptability. And that actually changes the shape of the organization, not just the processes used for innovation. And I see organizations increasingly building themselves like a box of Lego bricks. Instead of being deeply integrated and highly optimized, they're building their organizations in a way that can be ripped apart and reassembled to meet tomorrow's challenge. And that's a really fundamental shift, particularly with big organizations, to take.
Oh my goodness. Tom, I have to contain my desire to squeal with delight. I had no idea that you were going to talk about athletic organizations as a metaphor, and I love it. So like your podcasts that are just consistently full of surprises and really insightful stuff. Thank you for that. It brings to mind something I read this morning from another futurist named Joanna Lenkova, who had a guest post over on the Kedge blog, this morning where she said being right is a very short-term state, and it is better to be curious. So.
Yeah, hugely true, hugely true. I saw, and her name's going to escape me now, but the woman who wrote Mavericks at Work, Polly LaBarre. I saw Polly LaBarre speak a while back, and one of the things she was talking about is about how the greatest leaders now are going into work and going, I don't know. Right, I don't know all the answers. It's no longer all about sort of white men pointing right, as the front page of most business magazines used to be. It's about people going in and saying, I don't know, and asking the people around them for answers, and listening and learning and following what the experts around them say.
Wonderful. Speaking of things I don't know, we have a question from the audience, and I don't know what it is. But let's see what one of our live viewers wants to know from Tom. Tom, here's the question. What is your prediction for the ratio of invention versus extinction of technologies in coming years? Will there be a consolidation or overall more diversity?
So I think it's a really interesting question, particularly, I don't know if you saw the announcement from Jack Dorsey over on Twitter yesterday, that they're investing in a small team to build a standards-based system for social networks. And this is something I've been arguing will supersede all the social networks for many years. Years and years ago, I used to work with Real Networks, who invented streaming media. Years before Spotify and YouTube, they were the first people to put audio and video online. And everybody thinks that what killed Real Networks, I know they can kill them, they're still there as business, but what destroyed their dominance was Microsoft bundling Windows Media Player with Windows. It wasn't. What actually did them so much harm was standards coming in and people going, do you know what? We don't want one or two proprietary solutions. What we want is an open standard, so we can just open up our web browser, pick up our smartphone, and get the media we want. And the same thing ultimately is going to happen with social media, I think. And that's so you end up with this standard and lots of clients. And we've seen it on lots of previous technologies. And this comes to the crux of the question, because what I think we see is when we get early new technologies in, we get lots of proprietary standards, but ultimately they're going to go extinct sooner or later, and probably sooner rather than later based on the accelerated pace of change. But if we can build the standards bodies up to rapidly standardize these things and pull them into a much more open standard, then actually the extinction slows down. Everybody gets a smaller piece of the market, but the market is much more sustainable. So I think given the rate of innovation now and the ease of innovation, I think we're probably going to see an accelerated rate of both invention and extinction over the next few years. But it'll be down to that consolidation into standards that causes the extinction. And one of the spaces I'm fascinated by is the smart home space. And we're really starting to see this now. This consolidation around 2 or 3 standards backed by open source technologies, things like Home Assistant, which is a wonderful open source project. We're starting to see this consolidation now into more or fewer open standards rather than this incredible diversity of competing little tiny ecosystems.
Oh, that's fantastic. Such a great example from yesterday. That Twitter announcement was exciting. We here at Sprinklr are close partners with Twitter. We love them. But a proliferation of networks is something that we're real comfortable with as well. Our company currently ingests data from 23 different social networks and millions of other sources from all around the wide web in huge quantities. And our value add that we attempt to provide, that we do provide, is the ability to consolidate that from across diverse sources and ingest and analyze the resulting data in very large quantity and make it easy for companies to better understand their customers as a result of it. So if a million more social networks bloom, I'll be pleased both personally and professionally. Yes, yeah, that's real good news. So Tom, let's turn this around a little bit and look at this from a personal perspective. You wrote a wonderful blog post some time ago about skills that you believe are particularly important that all of us develop as individuals in order to thrive in this emerging era that we face. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so this whole thing started with a question from a body it's called the Institute of Chartered Accountants in the UK. It doesn't sound particularly exciting. You know, there are a bunch of people who professionally spend all of their time looking at the past, but actually they got me involved in looking at the future. And we started talking about the future of education and speaking to CEOs and speaking to people doing hiring and recruitment about what skills they were seeing coming from out of schools and out of universities and colleges, and what skills they wanted to see in the workplace. And this developed into a much longer piece of thinking for me about the nature of work in the future and the nature of education. Excuse me. And where I came to is this idea that actually, you know, I got really frustrated with people talking about the knowledge economy. You know, like knowledge is kind of cheap now. It's very hard to build an economy on knowledge because, as you say, you know, the next idea comes around the corner very, very quickly. You're being right is, you know, only gets you so far. What you need is the skills to adapt, the skills to learn, the skills to innovate and understand, and the skills to communicate. And so what we boiled it all down to was what we call the 3 C's. We talk about the 3 R's a lot in the UK, reading, writing, and arithmetic, which obviously aren't all R's. But I tried to make it all 3 C's to keep it simple. And the first skill that's really important is what I call curation. The ability to discover and qualify information, only getting more important in this age of deep fakes and fake news. In the middle of an election here in the UK has been particularly important. But what we need is people who can do what machines can't, which is, you know, discover sources of information, bring together disparate sources of information, qualify them, recognize the real from the fake, start to give them weighting and value. And that comes right down to the biggest gap in information to recognize, which is the gap in your own skills. We need people who are absolutely self-driven learners in the future. And the second skill I talk about is this creativity. And I don't know what the education system's like there, but in the UK, we have this terrible habit of teaching people very early on that they're not creative if they can't draw or play an instrument. You know, basically, you are creative if you can do pretty pictures, and if you can't, you're not. And what we've got to do is teach everybody that they can be creative, and that creativity is a muscle that can be developed, it can be trained and honed. And so we've got to have people who are, you know, excited about being creative, excited about learning, but excited about making new things now as well, and innovating, building new stuff, whether it's recombining existing things, going back to this sort of recombination aspect, or, you know, wholesale innovation, or just iterative. I mean, that iterative skill of trying something, failing, trying something, failing, trying something, failing until you succeed is hugely important skill to teach. And actually the creative subject's a really good place to teach it. The art subject's a really good place to teach it. And the third skill is about communication. You know, none of these things have value if you can't sell your ideas to your colleagues and your customers. And whether you're doing that visually or orally, or whether you're doing it standing on a stage or in the written word, it kind of doesn't matter. But you've got to have those communication skills to sell yourself, because increasingly I see us, you know, following that networks analogy I was talking about for organizations, you know, the ultimate destination for that is potentially all of us wrapped in a corporate shell, and there being no sort of companies anymore, and we're all working as individuals, collaborating to fulfill different tasks and solve different problems. And in that environment, everybody's very exposed and everybody has to communicate.
And be as creative as possible to generate value.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that, about the networks versus monoliths?
Yeah, so this started, but again, there's a fascinating memo that came out of, he was a former Amazon guy who joined Google. I'm going to forget his name now, it's terrible, but it's on my blog. And he was talking to people at Google at what Amazon was really good about. And he related this story of Jeff Bezos sending out a memo to everybody in Amazon saying, basically, stop talking to each other, wrap every function in the organization in a layer of software, and give me what I describe as the digital equivalent of the knobbly bobbly bits on the top and bottom of a Lego brick. So that rather than Amazon being one giant monolith, one deeply integrated organization, just another Walmart but with better technology, it's instead this box of Lego bricks that Jeff Bezos and the other senior leaders can look at and go, well, do you know what? We can take these Lego bricks and stack them up like this and make a new service over here. And actually, if that service doesn't work, I'm only having to pull down one Lego brick because the other bricks are already making money in different spaces. And do you know what? Just like when you're a kid and your friend comes around and they want to play with your Lego, my friends in other businesses can pick up one of these Lego bricks and they can take it into their business and build a business on that. And so what's happened over the last few years is that Amazon has become, yes, the sort of the retailer that we all look from the top down and see, but also this network of Lego bricks that allows anybody to pick up Amazon Web Services and build their own thing on it, and pick up, Amazon Logistics and build their own thing on it. Start to pick up all of these different digital chunks wrapped in APIs, but opened up to the rest of the world, just like they're opened up to everybody inside Amazon. And I'm seeing more and more organizations, actually both in the public and private sector, building themselves like that now. People call it different things. Shared services are starting to go that way. But they're basically taking every function in the business, wrapping it in the digital equivalent of the knobbly bits on Lego bricks, and allowing either people inside the organization to play with them and recombine them to innovate and find new opportunities, or actually sailing them out as wholesale businesses in their own right, or services in their own right, to people elsewhere in business, whether they're peers and competitors or people in completely different sectors of industry. And that for me looks like a much more flexible, agile, future-proof, frankly, way of doing business in the future.
Beautiful. Yes, I was just reading the Gartner maturity model on API strategy yesterday, and they said that one of the transitions that maturing organizations are making in their API strategy is moving from measuring the number of calls made to an API as a KPI to instead measuring the number of applications plugging into an API as the measure of its success.
Yeah, and I think that once you've got that diversity and you've got those whole ecosystems built on your API, that's power. That's an incredible amount of power. I find it absolutely fascinating. It comes back to this thing about innovation and the low friction in innovation now. One of the exercises I sometimes do with clients when I'm speaking, and I've got a room full of people for a couple of hours, I say, start a business. I say, there's 8 of you around the table, pick up your smartphones. Here's a list of things you have to do to start a business. You've got to go and get yourself a bank account. You've got to register online, the regulator in the UK. You've got to find a set up a website. You've got to find yourself a product and a supplier. You've got to sort out your logistics. And I give them a bunch of things to touch. When I set up my first business in 2005, it took me weeks. I needed professional support. It took me 6 weeks to get a bank account. You can do it all in an hour now. In fact, if there's 8 of you, you can do it in 20 minutes. And so, this ability to create these new layers now, to take other people's Lego bricks, plug them in, have it all work for you, automated in the background, and you just add that one piece of value with those 3 skills. It's hugely powerful.
I agree. I do want to offer a slightly contrary perspective, and that is in favor of the innovation power of larger organizations, many of whom I'm sure may be living in fear of the individual innovator and the lower barrier to entry. I was reading the Gartner maturity model on innovation management this morning, and they pointed out that one of the key evolutions along the maturation process is, in fact, moving from an individualistic culture of innovation towards instead a more mature model of concerted enterprise support for innovation on an ongoing basis, so that you don't have to handle any of that administrative work yourself as an individual, even albeit easier today than ever before, and so that innovations can be funded and scaled and learned from in a networked organizational context.
I'm kind of have a mission now, which is to save big organizations. They get so much abuse, big corporations, big business. There seem to be these sort of fat cats who are, raping and pillaging the world and the environment. And actually, you look at the behavior of some of these big organizations and actually how they treat their people. And many of them are really good places to work. They have the best pension schemes. They have the best sort of equal rights legislation and representation of that. They're working towards gender balance. They're doing all of these good things. And then they get disrupted by startups coming in, because what they haven't got is this innovation capability and this ability to foresee what's coming. And it feels to me like creative destruction is kind of very wasteful. I've been in startup land, and I like that world and enjoy that world, but creative destruction feels very wasteful. And if we could actually turn big businesses into these innovation engines where they're constantly reinventing themselves, constantly rising like a phoenix from the flames, I think we could actually protect a lot more good jobs and do the innovation and the progress with a lot less waste. And so whether or not it's a fool's errand, it feels like a sort of Sisyphean task, perhaps, but it's kind of become my goal to make big organizations much more innovative, much more future thinking, because I think they do so much right for all the abuse they get.
Fascinating. Well, and what a pleasure it is to get to hear your expert perspective on how to go about that, if even only for 30 minutes. Tom, it has been a joy to get to speak to you. As I said before the show, having listened to your podcast regularly, to hear that magnificent voice of yours here in a conversation is it's super fun. So I feel smarter from getting to have this conversation, and I really enjoyed it, and I appreciate it very much.
No, I really appreciate the opportunity, Marshall. I really do. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, folks, if you enjoyed this conversation with Tom, and I hope you did, please first like and subscribe to the Sprinklr channel to get subsequent conversations delivered to you. And then there are some great resources, ways that you can plug into Tom's work on an ongoing basis. Tom, can you tell us a little bit about the best way to do that?
Yeah, so tomcheesewright.com is your source for all things me. You'll find links to my book there, information about the work I'm doing and my podcast. And if you're a Twitter person, I'm fairly active on there as @BookOfTheFuture.
You are active. You're a great person to tweet with. Well, thank you again, Tom, so much. It's been a real pleasure. I look forward to continuing the conversation with you on Twitter and elsewhere. And to everyone who joined us today, thanks so much for your time. We'll see you next time. Have a great afternoon.